you're here, whether you stayed for lunch or whether you went home and ate and came back. We're really happy that you're here. Trust that this has been a blessed weekend for you. I know that some people last night, we had a nice crowd here, but there were people watching online, and I think probably that is happening this afternoon again. And then probably, obviously in the morning, there's some members that aren't able to get out, and they were watching online. So we have two audiences. And I want to tell you, Brian, that we actually have noticed on our website that there are people, I don't know how many of you know this, but there are people that watch us from all over the world, not just locally here. So it's actually pretty exciting. So you may have been ministering to someone in Japan or somewhere else in the world today, who knows. But we're glad that you're here today, and the presentation this afternoon that Dr. Strayer will share is Captain Joseph Bates, Captain of the Blessed Hope. And I think it was George Knight, Professor Knight, who said that he thought that Joseph Bates was the true founder of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And so we're really looking forward. He was quite a man, and that's all I'm going to say, because we want to hear from you. They didn't come to listen to me, but we're looking forward to the presentation. Let's just have a word of prayer, and we'll let Dr. Strayer share with us. Father, thank you so much for our rich history. Thank you for these great men and women of God, these pioneers that paved the way and planted the seeds for this church that has grown into a worldwide movement. As we listen to the story of Captain Joseph Bates today, be with Dr. Strayer as he shares. We pray that we'll be inspired and encouraged by his life story to be witnesses for you in sharing the great Advent message with all those that we can. May your Spirit be poured out upon us now, in Jesus' name. Amen. By the way, before Dr. Strayer comes up, just to remind you, when he's done with his presentation, there's going to be an opportunity for questions and answers. And so that's always a nice time, and he wanted me to make sure I announced that to you today. So.
It's obvious I'm not Dr. Strayer. We're here to sing, though. 444, I Am a Pilgrim. We're going to keep in keeping with our early Advent songs, 444. And some of you may know it, some of you may not know it, but what I want to hear some harmony. I want to hear some alto, some bass, some soprano, some tenor. Because I know it's out there. I can see you. I know you, who you are. So we're going to sing I'm a Pilgrim. Now you need to help me because these are early Advent songs, and I'm old, but I ain't that old, okay? So we're going to try this. 444, I'm a Pilgrim. All righty? Singing, I'm a pilgrim. going right across the page to 445. I'm but a stranger here. Where's our home?
Heaven.
Heaven. Heaven is my home. Soon to be home.
Amen.
But we know not the hour of the Lord's appearing. 6:04. So if we don't know the hour, what must we do? Be ready. Be watching ready. So sing like you mean it. We know not the hour of the Master's appearing, but we know he's coming. Okay. Shall
By the way, I don't know if you noticed it or not, but that was a Frank Belden song. Frank Belden was an early Adventist pioneer and hymn writer. He had a rather unique ability. While he was listening to an Adventist preacher preach, a hymn tune would come to his mind, and he would compose words to that tune during the worship service. And he would scratch it out on a piece of paper. And at the end of the service, he would play that hymn for the congregation based upon the sermon he had just heard. Isn't that amazing? Amazing. He composed dozens, perhaps scores even, of hymns. And he had that unique ability to do it during the service. It just boggles the mind to think that somebody has talent like that. Well, I just want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for coming, and some of you have been here for 3 services. You've had quite enough of Dr. Strayer. I'll be leaving tomorrow morning, give you a break, but it's been a joy. It has been a joy. I've met 5 former students, some of them going back 40 years. They remember I had dark brown hair and a mustache and hair down over my ears back in the 80s. And made some new friends, including a dear lady here who knows some South African friends of mine. It's just a wonderful Adventist family, isn't it? Amen. I've never been here before, and yet there are friends here that we've been friends for many, many years. I've told your pastor about an experience I had as a college student at Southern, where I worked at McKee's Bakery with a Baptist college student who went to Tennessee Temple College in Chattanooga. And I shared with him one day what a wonderful Adventist family I belonged to. I said, you know, I could go to almost any church in North America, any Adventist church, and I would find at least one person that I knew or who knew somebody that I knew really, really well. And he said, you know, Brian, he said, I could go to any Baptist church in the city of Chattanooga and be a perfect stranger. He said, once I left the walls of my own Baptist church, I would be a perfect stranger in any other Baptist church. So, there isn't a great Baptist movement, but there is a great Adventist movement. We're not just a church, we're a movement. And you make friends everywhere. And certainly Joseph Bates did that. I am persuaded that he was a champion maker of friends and walked everywhere. So let's talk about him. Joseph Bates, the captain of the Blessed Hope. Joseph Bates, from the time of his birth in 1792, was almost predestined to follow a seafaring career. Before he was a year old, his father, Joseph Bates Sr., moved the family to the whaling port of New Bedford, Fairhaven. New Bedford's on one side of the Acushnet River, and Fairhaven's on the other side of the river. So they're kind of hyphenated towns. As a boy, Joseph haunted the seaside docks, watching the great whaling ships set forth in pursuit of these giant sea mammals. He longed to sail with the merchantmen across the 7 seas to Europe and China, South America, and Australia in search of profitable trade. And every day, he would pass the Acushnet River. His parents, however, felt that he needed more education, leading to a more stable career than that of a sailor. So in 1798, Joseph Sr. established the Fairhaven Academy for boys, and it still stands today. Those of you that have taken New England Adventist tours have seen Fairhaven Academy. From 1800 to 1807, little Joseph attended this academy, receiving the standard New England grammar school education. But as he left home every day for school, the tangy sea air and the sight of the New Bedford harbor crowded with masts whetted his desire to go to sea. Finally, his parents concluded, when Joseph was 15, that maybe, just maybe, sending him on one voyage might make him seasick enough so it would cure him of his taste for the sea. So they booked their son as a cabin boy aboard the ship Fanny, bound for Europe with a load of wheat. Cabin boy is at the bottom of the hierarchy, the lowest gopher in the line of sailors. Now, the voyage over proved uneventful, but the trip back nearly cost Joseph his life. For days, a large shark followed the ship, always staying on one side of the boat and never getting close enough to be speared by the crew. One day, when Joseph was sent to the top of the mast to scout for other vessels, his foot slipped on the ropes and he fell 50 feet. Fortunately for him, his body struck another rope, which flipped him out into the sea instead of smashing him senseless on the wooden deck. But where was the shark? Suddenly a sailor shouted that the shark had moved to the opposite side of the boat and was swimming along placidly as though nothing had happened. Fortunately for Joseph, though the ship had moved on, a sailor threw him a rope and he caught the end of it and was pulled back on deck just in time. And at that moment of rescue, the thought flashed through Joseph's mind that his mother must be praying for him, because that shark had never changed its position before. Now, the teenager, Joseph Bates, made many trips across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe, voyages full of danger and adventure. At the age of 17, he left aboard ship for Russia amidst a war between Napoleon Bonaparte and most of the rest of Europe. Sailing up the English Channel in a dense fog, the ship struck an iceberg and began filling with water. Bates countermanded the captain's orders to abandon ship and began manning the pumps, and that action saved many lives. After getting the ship repaired in an Irish port, the crew joined a British convoy of 300 ships until they felt safe to head out alone. But some Danish privateers, and Denmark was an ally of Napoleon Bonaparte, Danish privateers stopped them and asked them where they had come from. And that was a crucial question. The captain knew that if they said they had just come from an Irish port, that meant they were on the side of Great Britain and they would be captured and imprisoned. So the captain tried to bribe the sailors into saying they had come directly from the United States, who was not involved yet in this war. But Joseph Bates refused to lie. When he was called before the court in Copenhagen, Denmark, Joseph told the truth. He stressed, however, that they had not been in the Irish port to trade anything, just to get repairs. He was very happy that he had told the truth when later he saw in prison some men with their thumbs and 2 forefingers cut off for lying in court. They had a little guillotine device on the judge's desk to cut off the fingers, because that's what you did. You raised those fingers when you were asked to take an oath to tell the truth. And if you lied, those were the fingers that would be cut off. Joseph returned to England, but while he ate supper in a boarding house one night, The door burst open, and in stomped a British officer, followed by a dozen soldiers with guns. They demanded to see Bates' papers. And although he could prove he had American citizenship, they impressed him anyway and put him in chains aboard the ship Princess. You see, back then, 200 years ago, the word impressed was not a good word. You would not say, I'm impressed by the sunset today. Well, 200 years ago, to be impressed meant you were shanghaied. You were taken into custody and forced to serve in a foreign nation's ship. And that's what happened to Joseph Bates. When he tried to escape, they transferred him to the St. Salvador del Mundo, along with some other Americans whom they accused of being absentee British citizens. When he and several Yankees again attempted an escape, they were put in chains and transferred to the warship Rodney in 1810. So poor Joseph Bates spent the next 5 years unwillingly serving in King George III's Navy. He had to eat dried bully beef, hard, wormy sea biscuits, and drink fiery grog rationed to all the sailors each day. He scrubbed the decks and polished the brasswork. Now, although he was a baptized Congregationalist, he was forced to attend Anglican services aboard the ship. He endured terrible Mediterranean storms and almost constant badgering to change his citizenship and join the British Navy as a bona fide Jack Tar. These hardships toughened Joseph not only for his later career at sea as a captain, but also for the spiritual battles he would have to fight for the Lord in spreading the three angels' messages. In 1812, now 20, Joseph was transferred aboard the Swift Shore for 3 more years in the Royal Navy as his own country, the United States, went to war with Great Britain in what we call the War of 1812. There we go. That's Joseph Bates as you've never seen him before. He's only 26. When Bates and 600 American prisoners tried to cut their way through the side of the ship Crown Prince using table knives as their companions sang American songs to cover their efforts, the Navy had had enough of these bothersome Yankees. To the dungeon cells of the dreaded Dartmoor prison, they were sent. And that's a kind of a landscape view of Dartmoor prison. Here Bates endured cold, damp stone floors, hard biscuits, and a very cruel governor who liked to whip his inmates. But God had his eye on Joseph Bates, and he emerged unhurt. Finally, in April of 1815, Bates and the Americans gained their release. When he finally returned home, his parents rejoiced to see him. It had been 5 long years. But after a few weeks' rest, he went to sea again, facing severe storms, ice that nearly crushed one ship, and pirates. But in 1818, Joseph, now 26, succumbed to the charms of Prudence Nye. This is a later picture of Prudy. But 6 weeks after their wedding, he headed out to sea again. From 1818 to 1826, Bates sailed to Germany, Sweden, the Bahamas, England, South America. He faced icebergs, storms, water rationing, piracy, and other dangers. But he endured. He became second mate, and then first mate, and finally captain of his own ship. And then he invested his fortune in some of the ships that he commanded, which made him part owner of several ships as well. And that meant that he got 50% of all the profit from the sale of the cargo. But Joseph Bates was not yet a Christian. He swore like a sailor. He read racy novels. He drank alcoholic beverages. And he only prayed when funerals required it. But by 1821, his wife, Prudy, was praying for him and began to change his life. Prudy also slipped religious tracts and a New Testament into her husband's large sea chest. On the next voyage, Captain Bates decided that he really loved his daily ration of grog far too much. So he gave it up. Next, he felt impressed that he should dispense with hard liquor. On another trip, he stopped drinking ales, and then beer, and finally wine and port. I'm sure his crew thought he was going crazy. Sailors always drank. On Bates' next trip, he gave up cigars. On the very next one, he quit chewing tobacco. But when he tried to stop swearing, he realized he needed more strength than his own willpower could produce. So he started reading a chapter a day from that little pocket Bible that Prudy had sneaked into his seaman's chest. As part owner of his next ship, the Empress, Bates received half the profit from the trips to South America in 1824. But he returned to his family not only richer materially, but far more blessed spiritually. For it was while reading the New Testament in those tropical waters of South America that Joseph Bates experienced true conversion. He writes this way, "My tongue was loosed to praise God," he exclaimed. "Peace like a river for weeks and months occupied my heart." In 1826, Captain Bates joined his wife's Christian Connection Church in Fairhaven, Massachusetts. And then he immediately set about to establish one of the very first teetotal societies in America. It was called the Fairhaven Temperance Society. And the Fairhaven Temperance Society required total abstinence, even from hard cider, which some temperance societies allowed. And Joseph Bates formed a cold water army of 300 local children who agreed to drink nothing but water for the rest of their lives. In fact, he used to have them march in parades holding up glasses of water. That would be kind of a real temperance witness, wouldn't it? 300 kids with glasses of water. From then on, Joseph Bates himself never drank any other beverage but water, which he called Adam's ale. Right? That's what Adam drank, the Garden of Eden. That was Adam's ale. As God showed him further light on healthful living, Bates gave up meat, spiced dishes, greasy foods, rich desserts. Long before Ellen White had her health vision in 1863, Bates was the leading temperance advocate in our church. Once, when he was asked to say a blessing at a church picnic, Bates, noting the presence of rich foods, pork, cakes, prayed this prayer: "Lord, bless all the clean, nutritious, wholesome, lawful food spread out before us." The rest of it didn't get blessed, okay? There were some smiles, I'm sure, around that picnic table, but Bates had made his point. He made his point with his crew on the next voyage in 1827. From now on, he said, there would be no intoxicating beverages on board. No swearing would be allowed. No shore leaves on Sunday, and daily prayers for those who wish to attend. Well, many of the soldiers grumbled, others scoffed. But you know, on that trip, there was not one single incident of fighting or quarreling among the sailors, and that was highly unusual. Soon there were 75 other New England ships that adopted Joseph Bates' temperance stand, and they reported trouble-free voyages. If Captain Bates in 1828 was becoming healthy and wise, he was also becoming immensely wealthy by the standards of his era. Having amassed a fortune of $16,000, and we have to multiply that by 25, I can't do that in my head, but I think it's pretty close to $250,000 at least. So at 36, he retired from the sea and became active in temperance and anti-slavery reforms. In 1832, he built a little farm, planted mulberry trees, and started a silkworm industry. Very unusual in Massachusetts, hoping to enjoy the life of the gentleman farmer. He then built a Christian Connection chapel where he and Prudy worshiped until 1839. But two cataclysmic events occurred during the 1830s. And those of you who know your American history, and particularly history associated with Adventism and the rise of the Millerite movement, will know that on November 13, 1833, Prudy and Joseph Bates witnessed what was called the falling of the stars. It was actually a meteorite shower that was seen throughout New England and much of the Midwest as well. Both believed that it fulfilled the prophecy of Matthew 24 concerning the signs of Christ's soon return. Then second, in 1839, he heard a Millerite preacher speak on the soon coming of Christ and prove from the Bible that it would occur about 1843 or 44. Intensive Bible study and interviews with leading Millerite preachers soon convinced Joseph that this was Bible truth. So in 1840, he became one of the leading agents or preachers for spreading William Miller's warning message, and he even chaired some of the Millerite Adventist conferences that met. Here are three pictures of Joseph Bates at various times in his early life. Because of his zeal, his age, his leadership skills, Bates became one of the leaders in the first Millerite conference at Joshua V. Himes' Chardon Street Chapel in Boston in 1840. And then he was the vice chair of the 12th conference in 1842, when leaders decided to begin holding camp meetings that summer. He declared, "I am come face to face with a tremendous enveloping cause. The cause of spreading the gospel of the three angels' messages would fill his life for the next 30 years. Now, Joseph Bates was never one to ask for an easy way in witnessing either. Most of the Millerites, as you know, preferred speaking to northern white audiences in churches and halls. But Bates and his friend here, Heman S. Gurney, actually went down south. They went to Maryland, which was a border state, a slave state in the 1840s. And there they preached to the blacks and to the whites in Maryland. One slave master was really angry and growled at them. "What's this I hear? Have you abolitionists come down here to get our slaves?" And Joseph Bates smiled back and said, "Yes, I have indeed come to get your slaves. And you too. I want you all to be saved." At another meeting, a heckler stood up and shouted at Bates, "We're going to ride you Yankees out of town on a rail." Joseph shot back, "You know, if you'd be so kind as to put a saddle on it, I'd rather ride than walk." The sea captain, who had faced all kinds of challenges on the oceans of the world, was not going to be intimidated by a heckler. The audience laughed and forced the heckler to sit down. Although a Bible student and Millerite preacher, however, Joseph Bates hungered to know more of God's truth. In August of 1844, he attended the Exeter, New Hampshire camp meeting. He was one of the main speakers there, but he felt impressed that new light would be revealed from God. So as he preached, he suddenly saw Mrs. Couch stand up near the back and say, "It's really too late to spend our time about talking about these truths with which we're familiar. The Lord has a servant here who has meat in due season for his household. So let him speak and let the people hear him. Well, Bates graciously turned the pulpit over to that man. His name was Samuel Sheffield Snow. And Snow presented his insights into the new, called the true, midnight cry message, showing that Christ would undoubtedly come on October 22, 1844. With thousands of other believers, Bates accepted this as light from the Lord. In fact, to demonstrate his faith, as I mentioned this morning, he refused to dig his potatoes that fall, just to show he honestly believed the Lord was coming. After the great disappointment passed and Christ had not come, Bates returned to his potato field and found every tuber in good condition. And all of his neighbors had lost their potatoes to that terrible black blight, that potato rot that 4 years later would destroy all the potatoes in Ireland and cause the great famine that killed 1 million Irish men and women. Because Joseph Bates loved the truth so much, God worked many miracles in his life to guide him into more light. Although he was still a Sunday keeper in 1845, Bates one day happened to pick up a copy of the newspaper The Hope of Israel from Portland, Maine. It was the February 28 issue, and it contained an article by a man named Thomas Preble proving that actually the seventh day was the Lord's Sabbath day. Well, puzzled, Bates heard there was a Sabbath-keeping Advent band worshiping up in Washington, New Hampshire, and he immediately resolved that he was going to go there and talk to them. By train, by stagecoach, and on foot, Elder Bates covered 140 miles. He arrived at the Frederick Wheeler home around 10 p.m. 10 p.m., farmers are all deep asleep. But he kept banging on the door until young George Wheeler came to let him in. And then the boy wakened his father. Bates came straight to the point, no small talk with Bates. Do you keep the seventh-day Sabbath? Yes. Yes, I do, Frederick Wheeler replied. Well, I am Joseph Bates, and I want to know more about it. Wheeler reached for his Bible, and together they sat at the kitchen table the entire night, studying the text of the seventh-day Sabbath. The next day after breakfast, Wheeler took Bates over to Cyrus Farnsworth in town, and together the three men continued their Bible study until noon. Finally convinced, Joseph Bates wanted to share his newfound truth with everybody. As he crossed the bridge from New Bedford into Fairhaven, Massachusetts, he met his old friend, James Madison Monroe Hall, named after 2 U.S. presidents. What's the news, Captain Bates? Hall inquired. The news, Bates boomed, is that the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord. James Hall spent that week studying his Bible with Bates, and together they kept the next Sabbath holy. In 1845, Bates attended the Port Gibson, New York Conference of Advent Believers, where he learned from Hiram Edson and others the real meaning of the sanctuary in heaven and what had happened there on October 22, 1844. And it was with great joy that he accepted that message. And then when it was his turn to take this stand, he chose to speak on the Sabbath truth that he loved so well. Amazed at this new teaching, Hiram Edson could hardly keep his seat. He jumped up and he exclaimed, Brother Bates, that is light and truth. The seventh day is the Sabbath, and I am with you to keep it. Realizing, however, the printed word could go places where the spoken word could not, Bates resolved to write a small pamphlet to explain the Sabbath truth to others. Day after hot day in August, he sat at his desk, laboring on that tract, which would later be titled the Seventh-day Sabbath, a perpetual sign. But Elder Bates faced a serious problem. And it was one so severe that until now he had kept it a secret, even from Prudy, his wife. He had in his pocket only a silver York shilling worth 12.5 cents. It's all the money he had in the world. But that precise moment, Prudy appeared in the doorway. "Joseph," she cried, "I'm in the midst of baking, and I don't have enough flour to finish my baking." "Oh, is that so?" commented her husband from his desk. "How much flour do you need?" "Oh, I'd say about 4 pounds," she said. "Okay." Shortly, he rose and went out, and buying 4 pounds of flour, he came in and left it on the kitchen table while she was temporarily outside. But shortly she reappeared at the door, a suspicious look on her face. "Joseph, where did this 4 pounds of flour come from?" "Well, I bought it. Isn't that what you wanted, dear?" "Well, yes, but have you, Captain Joseph Bates, a man who has sailed with cargoes worth thousands of dollars, gone out and bought just 4 pounds of flour?" Then he had to tell her, "Prudy, for those 4 pounds of flour, I spent the last money I have on earth." Her apron flew to her eyes as the tears flowed, and with a sobbing voice she cried, "What are we going to do?" Joseph Bates rose to his full height. I am going to write a book on the Sabbath, and I'm going to distribute it everywhere to carry the truth to the people. "Well, yes, dear, that's very nice," she said, "but what are we going to live on?" "Oh," he answered, "the Lord will provide." "Oh, yes, the Lord will provide. That's what you always say." Exit Mrs. Bates in tears for the bedroom. A short while later, Joseph felt impressed to go to the post office. When Postmaster Drew handed him a letter, he remarked, "Excuse me, Captain Bates, but there is postage due on this letter." Bates confessed he hadn't even a nickel with him, but he felt impressed the letter contained some money. So would the postmaster please open it for him? The postmaster did so and found $10 inside. That would be the equivalent of $250 today. $10. From a man who said that the Lord had impressed him that Brother Bates needed the money right now. After paying the postage, Bates went to the dry goods store and purchased flour, potatoes, and sugar, instructing the grocery boy to put them on the back porch. He also went to the print shop and made arrangements for the printing of his forthcoming book on the Sabbath. When he arrived home, Prudy demanded to know where those groceries had come from. "Oh," he said, "the Lord sent them." "What do you mean the Lord sent them?" she replied. "Prudy," he said, "read this letter, and you will know how well the Lord provides." Prudence Bates read it. And then she went into the bedroom and had another good cry, but for a very different reason. The Sabbath pamphlet in Bates' later book entitles him to be called the Apostle of the Seventh-day Sabbath Truth among Seventh-day Adventists. His tract soon reached the newlyweds, James and Ellen White, who accepted it as light from the Lord. Perhaps because he felt personally responsible for defending the Sabbath, Bates could be somewhat intransigent about the best manner of keeping the day. As a former sea captain, he knew that the sun always set at 6 p.m. at the equator, year-round. Thus, he came to the reasoned belief that God's people should keep Sabbath holy from 6 p.m. Friday to 6 p.m. Saturday evening. And because of his age and his experience, his opinion bore great weight among the believers for more than 10 years. But in 1855, the young John Andrews studied the matter thoroughly and wrote a paper defending the sunset time as being the best meaning of the biblical phrase, "From even unto even shall ye keep my Sabbaths." Gradually, persuaded, all the Seventh-day Adventists began shifting to sundown observance. All, that is, except for two, Joseph Bates and Ellen White. The 63-year-old sea captain refused to be persuaded at first. Well, Mrs. White reasoned that if for 10 years they had been keeping the Sabbath from 6 p.m. to 6 p.m., why change now? What's the big deal? On November 20, 1855, however, she received a vision from God pointing out that she was wrong in her view. And then both she and Joseph Bates switched to sundown observance. You see, Joseph Bates could be stubborn when truth was at stake, but he was no blockhead, for he believed in the spirit of prophecy. And if Ellen White had a vision on the matter, that settled the matter for him. It had not always been that way. In 1846, he admitted, "I'm a doubting Thomas. I do not believe in visions. If I could believe that the testimony of this dear sister," he's referring to Ellen White, "that she has related tonight was indeed the voice of God to us, I would be the happiest man alive." I believe the speaker to be sincere, but I cannot explain in regard to her being shown the wonderful things she has related to us. And for some time, he continued to believe that her visions were perhaps a protracted, debilitated state of her body. But at Topsham, Maine, in November of 1846, Bates heard her relate a vision in which she had seen Jupiter and Saturn and Uranus and Orion and described them in far more graphic, detailed terms than any astronomer with which Joseph Bates was very familiar. "This is of the Lord," he therefore concluded, "and is given to comfort and strengthen his scattered, torn, and peeled people." See, he knew that Ellen White was virtually ignorant on the subject of astronomy. With only 3 or 4 years of elementary education, she had never studied the subject of astronomy. She admitted it to him one time. "I've never picked up an astronomy book," she said. And so this was convincing to him. "I believe her to be a self-sacrificing, honest, willing child of God," he added. Now of Bates, Ellen White said, "I found him to be a true Christian gentleman, courteous and kind. He treated me as tenderly as though I were his own child." The elder statesmen of the church played a leading role in the 1848 Sabbath conferences, which helped to hammer out the doctrinal platform and establish the Sabbath truth in our church, and the sanctuary, and the spirit of prophecy, and the second coming of Jesus, and the state of the dead, all those S doctrines that the brother was talking about this morning here in Sabbath school. He also attended the meetings at Valney and Port Gibson, New York. Returning from this last meeting on a packet boat on the Erie Canal with James and Ellen White, Bates saw that the boat to which they were to transfer at Centerport was not going to stop. Well, James lifted Ellen up in his arms and jumped across the gap from one boat to the other, landing safely on the deck of the passing boat. Captain Bates, however, caught his heel on the packet boat's edge, and he fell backwards into the water with his dollar fare in one hand, his hat and purse in the other, and came up gasping for breath. Now here's a little trivia for you. Fortunately for Captain Bates, the Erie Canal at that section, at that time, was only 4 feet deep. It was later widened and deepened to be 10 feet deep. But he could at least stand up and not drown. In the bargain, he lost his dollar. But Providence took a hand, even in this unfortunate incident. For when the three of them found lodging in town with the Harris family and shared the Sabbath truth with them, both the husband and the wife accepted it and became lifelong Sabbath-keeping Adventists. Indeed, the first Adventist converts that we know of in Cayuga County. So one family's accident turned out to be another family's triumphant discovery of gospel truth. Despite his faults, Bates combined many wonderful traits in his character. In the main, he was the soul of magnanimity, deference, and genuine affection. He's often described as intrepid, inventive, indefatigable, self-disciplined, dedicated, and kind. He usually exhibited a gentlemanly demeanor and grave courtesy. But he could also be daring and eager, a man of action rather than a man of contemplation. In 1857, for example, when he was 65 years of age, Joseph Bates baptized 7 individuals in the dead of winter, standing in a water hole cut through 3 solid feet of ice in a river with the air temperature minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. How many of our Adventist pastors would be up to that? Yeah. I think they'd say, oh, please, wait till spring. Wait till spring. Joseph Bates, in the middle of winter, an icy, icy river. How could he endure such torture, we ask? James White gives us one clue in his description of Joseph Bates later in life. His countenance was fair, his eye was clear and mild, his figure was erect and of fine proportions, because his life of rigid temperance in eating as well as in drinking, and his labors in the pure sphere of moral reform had regenerated the entire man, body, soul, and spirit, until he seemed almost recreated for the special work to which God had called him. Later on, James White would describe Joseph Bates when he was in his 70s as having the spring in his step like that of a teenager. Yeah. Annie Smith once wrote a poetic line about Father Bates, describing him as one weary, sad, and torn, with eager steps press on the way, who long the hallowed cross had borne, still waiting for that promised day. Well, many a line of grief and care upon his brow was furrowed there. I asked what buoyed his spirits up. Oh, this, said he, the blessed hope. We sang that song this morning. We sang it this morning. Greetings in the blessed hope was Elder Bates' common salutation to all whom he met. Not, hi, how are you? Greetings in the blessed hope. And if they didn't know what he meant by the blessed hope, that was his opening. That was his Bible study opportunity. Yes, indeed. And he made thousands of friends. No Adventist pioneer, I'm convinced, covered more territory than the roving Bates, and a lot of it on foot. You know, one time he and Hiram Edson met in Auburn, New York, and hiked around Lake Ontario, all the way around, including Canada and the United States. You might want to look at a picture of Lake Ontario. Google it or something. That took them several days to get around Lake Ontario, and it was in the winter time, and there was snow to tramp through. He was a champion walker. Yeah. From 1844 to 1852, Bates preached from Maine to Michigan, entering Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, Ontario, and Quebec, seeking what he called the scattered sheep. Shrinking from no hardship, in his untiring zeal, he waded through deep snow, often tramping up to 40 miles to the back settlements. He paid his entire way, including any printing expenses to publish his tracts. Now, he was ready to preach the three angels' messages the moment he found a nail on which to hang his prophetic chart. He rarely spent more than 2 to 4 days in each place. His 4 stock lectures, in fact, covered all the range of the Seventh-day Adventist message. He crowded them all into 4 sermons, kind of like a Reader's Digest version of the 28 fundamental beliefs, we would say today. And then he would sign up new believers for subscriptions to the Advent Review and Sabbath Herald to keep them nurtured in the faith. Once, he even paused along the road to witness to W.H. Crapo, who at the time was the governor of Michigan. The governor of the state of Michigan stopped his coach to hear Joseph Bates pray for him. I don't know if any Adventist minister in Michigan has prayed for Governor Gretchen Whitmer. Given the problems she faces now, she needs prayer. I don't know if any Adventist minister has ever offered to do that. Is it any wonder then that God specifically chose Joseph Bates for a special assignment in July of 1849? As Bates held meetings in South Bend, Indiana, God gave him an impressive dream one night. In this dream, Bates saw himself heading northeast in a stagecoach to a town whose name he wasn't given. But when he awoke, he felt strongly impressed. He needed to go to that unnamed town. So catching the next stage, he paid the fare only as far as the next town, and then he dismounted, walked up and down several streets, but failed to recognize any of those he'd seen in his dream. So he paid the fare to the next town on the route. I believe this is Old US 12, goes along the southern border of Michigan today. Finally, the stagecoach on July 27 pulled into Jackson, Michigan, and he immediately recognized the main street as the town he'd seen in his dream. Collecting his luggage, he found a boarding house and asked, "Are there any former Millerites living in this town?" The proprietor told him that 20 former Millerite Adventists met each Sunday at the home of a local blacksmith named Dan Palmer. Checking his bags, Bates strode off down East Main Street and stopped near Van Dorn Street at Joshua and Dan Palmer's, 2 brothers, blacksmith and carriage shop. He introduced himself, noticed there was a vacant nail on the wall. You would expect that at a blacksmith shop, right? Hung up his chart, and, well, Dan Palmer continued to hammer away at the anvil. Joseph Bates began hammering gospel truth into him. He covered the second coming of Christ, launched into a discourse on the sanctuary truth, which was the very key to the disappointment of 1844. And at the close of the study on the Sabbath, Palmer dropped his hammer, extended his hand, and said, "Brother Bates, I think you have the truth." He invited the preacher to board at his home. Now, during the following week, Dan Palmer took Bates all over Jackson County to visit every one of those 20 Advent Millerite believers. The following rainy Sunday, they gathered in the Palmer parlor to hear Bates present some of his new light on the Sabbath, the sanctuary, the third angel's message. And within the next 3 weeks, all 20 Adventists in the Jackson area were keeping the Sabbath together. God had sent a man with a dream to establish the first Sabbath-keeping band of Adventists west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, from 1850 to 52, Bates held meetings in eastern Canada with Hiram Edson, establishing the first Sabbath-keeping Advent bands up in Quebec and Ontario. And then he took the train to Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois. I kind of like to think of Joseph Bates as being the Adventist Johnny Appleseed. Johnny Appleseed was going throughout Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, on foot. And that's what Bates was doing, too, with a different message, of course. He's kind of the Johnny Appleseed of the early Adventist movement. And so in 1852, the Holy Spirit led him to Battle Creek. And at the post office, he asked the postmaster who he considered to be the most honest man in Battle Creek. Because he was figuring, if he can direct me to the most honest man, the honest man is going to accept the truth, right? Well, you need to go see the peddler, David Hewitt, on Van Buren Street near Cass. So Bates arrived at the Hewitt home at breakfast time. They invited him in for the meal, and Bates spent all that afternoon and the next 2 days, actually, studying the Bible with the Hewitt family. And they accepted the new truth and kept the next Sabbath holy. Until the first Battle Creek Adventist Church was built in 1855, the Hewitt home became the meeting place for all the believers in Battle Creek. Another new field was Iowa. And there, among the corn and the hogs, Bates again became the first Advent pioneer by 1854. But Prudy felt that her aging husband should slow down. Time to take life a little easier, she told him. Smiling, the old sea captain said, "Prudy, we have all of eternity that we can enjoy together. Only a few more years, and the night cometh when no man can work." He basically agreed with James White's motto, which was, it's better to wear out than to rust out. But he did make one concession. Since Prudy lived back in Fairhaven, Massachusetts at this time, and Bates spent most of his time here in the Midwest, he built a new home for her in Monterey, Michigan. Joseph and Prudy moved into their new home in 1858. Bates also built a new meeting house for the Sabbath keepers there, and Prudy became the local church reporter to the Review. In 1854, April of 54, Bates discovered that believers in Jackson, Michigan were building a new meeting house. In fact, this was the very first church building built by Sabbath-keeping Adventists anywhere in the world. So in Jackson, in April of 54, they built their meeting house. It wasn't until the spring of 1855 that Battle Creek believers built their first meeting house. And then in the summer of 55, the believers up in Bucks Bridge, New York, built their first meeting house. So that's kind of the bing, bing, bing of the first three Advent meeting houses. Because of Bates' age and experience, church leaders asked him to chair important conference sessions during the 1850s and 60s. He chaired a Battle Creek conference in 1856. He preached in the brand new House of Prayer, as Adventists tended to call their churches. They didn't use the word church until the 1890s. They called them houses of prayer or meeting houses. He also chaired the important 1860 session when we chose our official name, Seventh-day Adventist, and organized the Review and Herald Publishing Association. The elderly Bates often teamed up with younger ministers, kind of a teacher, mentor, mentee relationship. They would help him pitch the evangelistic tent. He would guide them in their preaching techniques and methods. One of his early pupils was John Corliss, future missionary to Australia and England. Also, because he and James White were the most experienced leaders, they signed the certificates that were issued to all new preachers. In 1861, Joseph Bates was elected to the highest administrative office he ever held in his life. And that was the first president of the Michigan Conference, with Uriah Smith as secretary. But in 1865, Joseph and Prudy received a very sad letter from an Eastern shipping company. Their son, Joseph III, who at 14 had gone to sea on a whaling ship, like his father, and who in his 20s had been injured by a whale, had now been lost at sea. I'm sure that the Bates' firm belief in the blessed hope of the resurrection helped to comfort them at this sad and tragic time. In 1868, now 76 years old and still going strong, Elder Bates and Prudy attended the first official camp meeting at Wright, Michigan. Then he began working on his autobiography, The Life of Joseph Bates. But in August of 1870, tragedy struck once again. His dear companion contracted a fever and chills, which raged for days. On Sabbath, as the sun set, the 77-year-old Prudence Bates passed to her rest. "Oh, I am so tired," she gasped. Joseph reported in the review that they had had family worship together for 44 years. They had been happily married for 52 and a half years, and that for 60 years she had been a faithful Christian. After his wife's burial in Poplar Hill Cemetery in Monterey, Joseph's eldest daughter came to live with him and look after him. She gave her dad excellent meals and cared lovingly for him when he was home to be cared for. In fact, Father Bates continued to travel and preach in Michigan right up to the last month he lived. Even Ellen White began to worry that her octogenarian friend was overdoing things. So, in the last letter that he wrote to her on February 14, 1872, Bates reassured Ellen White that he was not starving, that he had more than enough good food to eat, and that if he ever had any lack of nutritious food, then he said, "I have some good, faithful brethren who seem to be waiting to serve me." I'm sure that was very reassuring to Ellen White. When the much-beloved captain of the Blessed Hope contracted a streptococcus infection in the spring of 1872, he was rushed to Battle Creek Sanitarium. And there, suffering such intense pain as few men have ever been called upon to pass through, Elder Bates died in his 80th year. Elder W.H. Littlejohn, who also has the fame, I suppose, of being our only blind Seventh-day Adventist preacher at that time. He was the resident pastor of the Battle Creek Church, and he was blind, gave Joseph Bates' funeral sermon. "Our much beloved and greatly lamented brother," he said, "sleeps in Jesus." Father Bates was buried beside his wife in Poplar Hill Cemetery near the meeting house he had built years before. And you can see their graves if you go there to Monterey, Michigan. Most appropriately, Elder Littlejohn took his text from 1 Thessalonians 4, which describes that glorious day when the trumpet shall sound and the dead will come forth, the very blessed hope that Joseph Bates had preached all of his life. Adventists across America mourned him deeply. There was hardly a church in New England or here in the Midwest where his converts were not found. Remembering the Advent cause, even in his death, Elder Bates willed his home and his farm to the Seventh-day Adventist Publishing Association. Certainly, the inscription on his tombstone understates the case when it declares that he remained a venerated and loved pastor until his death. From impressed British sailor to sea captain, from temperance reformer and abolitionist to Millerite agent and organizer, from Adventist preacher and pamphleteer to conference president, and and pioneer into many, many new areas. God had a plan for Joseph Bates' life, and he greatly blessed him, a courageous man, as he allowed the Lord to work through him. God has a plan for your life as well. Are you praying and studying his word to discover what that plan might be? May the life of Joseph Bates continue to inspire each one of us to prepare for that day of the blessed hope, is my prayer. Thank you. Now it's your turn. Some of you were not here last night to participate in our Q&A time. So this is your opportunity to pull out that long list of questions you've been saving for years, just waiting for some innocent victim like me to come along. Oh yes, we have a roving mic. Good.
Hello, Doctor. I'm one of your students,
Yes, I remember you. Give me the name.
Clifford.
Yes, okay. I remember faces better than names at my
Yes,
age.
sir. Did you know that you had a nickname amongst the students?
That had what?
You had a nickname.
Oh, no?
Your class was known to be quite difficult,
Yes.
so you were affectionately known as Dr. Slayer.
Oh, yes. Okay, all right. Strayer the Slayer, yes. Dr.
Yes, sir.
Slayer,
There you
okay. All right.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't heard that in quite a few years.
Well, that's what I'm
I
here
gave
for.
all essay quizzes and all essay tests, yes.
So I had just related to Adventist history, things I've been wondering.
Okay,
So not unusual that Adventists and Mrs. White would be part of the temperance movement.
right.
Did we have a stance as a denomination, or did she have a stance regarding three things: Western expansion and the fate of indigenous Americans, and a little later on, American imperialism? I'm thinking of the Anti-Imperialism League and the like. Anything that our church took a stand on in that regard?
With regard to the first, I don't recall reading anything in the published works of Ellen White about American expansion and the effects that it had on the Native Americans. I think the only time that James and Ellen White had a brush with the Indians out west was during their cattle drive. I talked about that yesterday. Their cattle drive from Texas up to Oklahoma. There was an unfortunate incident in which some native peoples, some Indians, stole some of their horses. That was not uncommon. I mean, there was nothing against the whites. The Plains tribes were always stealing horses from each other, so why not steal from the white man as well? As I recall, the horses were recovered. They got the horses back. But that was kind of the only brush that they had with Native Americans. As far as imperialism goes, that would be the 1890s, you know, the War of 1898, the war with Spain and all that. Again, I don't recall reading anything in her published writings about that at all. Ellen White tended not to be much interested in politics. It just wasn't, you know, part of her radar, so to speak. I did mention, you know, when the city fathers in Battle Creek were going to bring up the liquor issue on Sabbath, she did quite boldly say, if that's, you know, what they're going to do, knowing that the Adventists would be in church on Sabbath, then we ought to vote on Sabbath. All the men ought to get out and vote against the liquor ordinance. But, you know, most of the time she wasn't politically oriented on issues that, you know, you and I might think were of major importance at the time. She tended to look more at religious and spiritual and temperance issues. For her, temperance was a moral issue. I know in U.S. history it became very, very politicized, obviously. The Prohibition movement, the 18th Amendment, and so forth. Very politicized. But for her, temperance was not a political issue. It was a moral issue. And that's how most Adventists saw it. That's why most Adventists got behind the Prohibition movement and the amendment to the Constitution to ban alcohol. I know of only one Adventist evangelist. This was a woman, a female preacher and evangelist, who didn't get on the bandwagon because she was afraid that it was maybe kind of an overlap of church and state, that a church as a body should not take a stand on prohibition. Individuals could, but not an organized church. So she was kind of marching to a different drummer. But most Adventists, seeing temperance as a moral issue, got on the bandwagon of prohibition and were very happy when the amendment was passed, forbidding alcohol in America. But regarding your other two questions, there may be some unpublished material that I'm not aware of in the E.G. White manuscript collection. But I'm not aware of any published material on the Native American issue or the expansion of America to the West. She made, 8 or 10 trips by train across the United States. So she saw, the West in all of its beauty. And she did tend to see the beauty. A lot of Americans in the 19th century described the Great Plains as the Great American Desert. And that's how it would appear on maps. Great American Desert. She saw the beauty of the flowers, the beauty of the mountains, the beauty of the cactus, the beauty of the streams. She saw beauty because she saw God's handiwork in nature. That's how she saw nature, was God's handiwork. Yeah. Don't be shy now. This is your chance. I don't know whether the pastor's going to invite me back or not. He may not be happy with me. I don't know. This is your chance. Okay, if no one else. You sat in my classes. You know I encourage discussion.
Geographically speaking, Southern Africa is part of the Southern African or an Indian Ocean division. Now, there was a time when there was a Southern African Union conference, and it skipped and answered directly to the General Conference. I'm just wondering if you knew anything about it.
Here's the lady right there who does. Oh, well, I know you're from South Africa. I figured you were the expert. I don't remember the years exactly, but I think it had to do with the period of apartheid. I think it was that particular period there, the 60s, 70s, 80s. South Africa, as our dear sister knows, was being, what would be a proper word, banned. Trade was curtailed, sports was prevented, international sports and all that sort of unpleasantness because of the apartheid issue there. And I think that was the period when they felt like it would probably be politically astute for South Africa to be administered directly by the General Conference rather than by an African Indian Ocean entity that might contain, well, would obviously contain both blacks and coloreds and Asians and whites, and that might, create some problems, some tensions there. So it was taken over directly. I think China is the same way today. I think China is directly under the General Conference. And there have been some other territories, regions as well, that were basically administered as General Conference trust regions because of political tensions, racial tensions, social tensions in the area.
So, my question. Hello? Well, anyway, how, I don't know, which is why I'm asking,
Yeah.
how is it that, what was the genesis, what was the beginning of, because, William Ellis Foy, and there were African American and Millerites. There was no sort of separation. How is it that the whole, like the separate Allegheny Conference and all of those things, how did that even happen?
Are we still in South Africa?
No, sorry. Here.
Oh, you jumped on
Yeah,
me
I did.
and
I
didn't
did.
give me a
related,
good,
but sorry. Ineffective
okay.
transition.
Okay. Yeah. Well, basically, that happened in the 1940s, the development of the regional conferences in the 1940s. In part, it was felt that the work would grow stronger and faster if African Americans worked for African Americans. It was also felt by many that this would give more African Americans an opportunity for leadership positions, to develop their skills as leaders. It was also felt that funds that were being raised by church entities were going to benefit white institutions like sanitariums, colleges, academies, at the expense of black institutions that were not being developed or were not being improved and expanded at the rate that white institutions were. And of course, in America, you've got segregation to deal with in those early years as well. Sad but true that our black workers could not eat in the General Conference cafeteria. Our black workers and families could not receive treatment at white sanitariums. Blacks were excluded from many of our academies and colleges. I know my college, Southern Missionary College, as it was then called, typically was all white until 1966, when the federal government said, if you don't integrate, you're going to lose all the National Defense Student Loan money, you're going to lose the Pell Grants, you're going to lose all of our support for your students. So I know my freshman year at Southern, there were about 10 African Americans there. Most of the rest were simply encouraged to go down to Oakwood College, which was a junior college at that time, and became a senior college and now a university. But I know that the chairman of the history department there at Southern told me one time, I was a history major and I worked in the history department. He said, I've always been sad that we did the right thing for the wrong reason. We did the right thing by integrating, and he was on the committee. In fact, I think he was the chair of the committee at the time of integration there at Southern. He said, we did the right thing, but we did it for the wrong reason. We waited until the government forced our hand, and we should have done it from, Christian charity, and because it's the right thing to do. I'm happy to see that my alma mater, when it sends out marketing material and publications and so forth, is now quite well integrated. Not just African Americans, but Hispanics and foreign students and Asians and so forth. It was not that way in the 60s until 1966. So there were several reasons why that was felt to be necessary. I've read much on that situation, and quite frankly, blacks and whites are divided. There is no clear consensus on it today. I've read a book by a very eminent black man. I can't think of his name right now. He's got a PhD, who argues in favor of keeping the regional conferences. And there are others who argue that they've outlived their usefulness. They should be blended. They should be integrated. I don't know, this side of the second coming will ever solve that issue. At one time in the early 1980s, there was discussion of starting black unions as well. Not just black conferences, but take the next step. And the feeling at that time, and it was voted down, was if we go that direction, then we may end up splitting our church, just as the Methodists and the Baptists split in the 1840s over racial issues and slavery. We didn't want to go that route. I will say, to the credit of my sister from South Africa, I think you've done a better job post-apartheid in South Africa than we have done here in North America. I think you've done a really admirable job in South Africa. And they had to recover there from an apartheid that split 4 ways. You know, there were blacks, coloreds, Asians, and whites. We had a 2-way split. Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Yes, that's right. Yes, all the African languages and so forth. So, I think we can see the Holy Spirit at work there in South Africa. Time will tell. Time will tell. You brought up a real sticky issue. There's no clear answer, because both white Adventists and black Adventists are on both sides of the fence. Because there are those who feel that the regional conferences give our African American brothers and sisters the best opportunity for leadership. They wouldn't get it in a white conference or a white union. And then most recently, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the retirement package for black Adventist workers is different from the retirement package for white Adventist employees. And that inspired the African American regional conferences to band together and start their own retirement package for black Adventist church workers. It wasn't fair, primarily because demographic statistics show that black people die at younger ages, black people catch more diseases, certain kinds of diseases and illnesses, and whites live longer and don't catch as many of those illnesses. So the health package, the health compensation, the medical compensation, the retirement benefit package was not as high for black Adventist workers as for whites. And so they've developed their own retirement package, taking the money out of the North American Division funds to do that. I leave that up to you to decide whether that was the right move or not the right move, but there's no quick and easy answers here. I don't know where we will be 10 years from now if we're not in the kingdom, but I wish we were at that place where we could just all get along lovingly, unitedly, peaceably, cooperatively, together. I wish we were. I wish we were. But we're not. That's the bold truth about it. We're not there yet. And maybe the Holy Spirit will lead us there someday. I think based upon when you were born and how old you are, you'll have different views on this issue. I grew up during the Civil Rights era. So I tend to say, let's all get together. Let's make it work. But there are others who feel the time hasn't come yet for that. I'm glad to see that the Centerville Seventh-day Adventist Church is an integrated church. Yeah. That is a positive, forward-looking step. So is Pioneer Memorial Church. People from all over the world, all ethnic groups, all racial groups. Going to be no apartheid in heaven. No segregation in heaven. We need to get along down here best we can. All right. That was the stickiest question I've ever answered. The rest of them are going to be easy. Go ahead. Raise your hand. Whew, boy.
I have a question for you with respect to the Sabbath. In your presentation, I did not hear any mention of Rachel Oakes Preston. And I want to ask you, what role did she play in advancing the Sabbath truth among Adventists?
Very crucial role. Very crucial role. I include her in all of my New England tours. I've led 2 or 3 now before COVID hit. And we visit the Rachel Oakes Preston areas, the sites, Washington, New Hampshire, Vernon, New York. And Rachel Oakes Preston was a crucial person in this. She was a Seventh-day Baptist, as you probably already know, and she was listening to a sermon by Elder Wheeler in the Washington, New Hampshire church in, I believe it was December of 1844, and he was getting his congregation ready for the communion service. And he was saying that only those who kept all the 10 commandments should be able to participate in the communion service. And she just about sprang out of her pew because she knew there was one commandment that Wheeler and the rest of his congregation weren't keeping, and that was the 4th. But she decided to, to let decency, I suppose, respect, get the better of her. And so instead, she invited Elder Wheeler to her home for a visit, pastoral visit. And when he got there, she told him, she said, you said that nobody should participate in the communion service who doesn't keep all the 10 commandments. Well, there's one commandment you aren't keeping. Obviously, that was shocking to him, but she pointed out that the 4th commandment mandated the keeping of the Saturday Sabbath as the Lord's day. He studied the matter and concluded within a week or so that she was right. And so he preached a sermon before his congregation that he was going to keep the Seventh-day Sabbath from then on, and those who felt so persuaded could join him. As I understand it, it split the church. About half of the church decided to become Seventh-day Sabbath keepers, and the other half decided to remain as Sunday keepers. So half of them, used the church on Saturday, and the other half used it on Sunday. Now, through her, others may also have heard the message, but the fact that she converted the pastor, Elder Wheeler, to the Sabbath meant that he, in turn, also talked to others as well. And pretty soon we have a guy named Thomas Preble, I mentioned his name earlier, who actually wrote a tract about the Seventh-day Sabbath. And that tract was read by Joseph Bates. And thus Joseph Bates, the pioneer, the apostle, the captain of our blessed hope, became one of the leading expositors of the Seventh-day Sabbath. And one of his tracts reached James and Ellen White in 1846. So, you kind of have a ripple effect here, starting with Rachel Oakes Preston and Wheeler and Preble and Bates and White. So, she is the, what would you say, the igniter, the original starter of a growing interest in the Seventh-day Sabbath. It starts with her. Now, the interesting fact is that Rachel Oakes Preston herself was a Seventh-day Sabbath keeper, but did not become a Seventh-day Adventist until near the very end of her life. I believe it was in the last year of her life. She actually became a baptized Seventh-day Adventist. I don't know why she waited so long. But, she didn't necessarily combine all of the beliefs of the Seventh-day Adventist people with the Seventh-day Sabbath, which she was a Seventh-day Baptist, of course, so she'd been keeping it all her life. But she became a Seventh-day Adventist toward the end of her life. And her home is still standing in Vernon, and we Go by that, take pictures of it on my tours. And of course, the Washington, New Hampshire church is also still standing. It's not used as regularly as it once was, I think in part because it has no source of heat. And those New Hampshire winters can be very cold, very severe. So only in the late spring, summer, and early fall is that church used by both Advent Christians and Seventh-day Adventists. Yeah. Crucial person, Rachel Delight Oakes, and then her married name was Preston. She also had a daughter named Rachel Oakes, and I think she had the same middle name, Delight. She was a school teacher up there in New Hampshire. Yeah. Married one of the Farnsworth, Cyrus. She married Cyrus Farnsworth, the daughter did. So she was connected with one of the early pioneer families. Big family, had 22 children. 22 Farnsworth kids. Yeah. Her grave is still there in the Washington, New Hampshire cemetery. You can see her grave and the other Farnsworth family members' graves there too. I don't know how you're going to reach up there, but there's a hand up. Oh, delightful. Good.
If somebody was interested in learning more about church history, do you have any resources that you would recommend?
If somebody want to learn more about what?
About church history, any
Oh.
resources that you would recommend?
Goodness. Oh, my. We don't have time. I have 2 bookcases full of Adventist history books. Just, yeah. Well, you know, this is a little bit self-serving, I suppose, but I'm going to put in a plug for the Adventist Pioneer series. There are now a dozen books. The first one on James White, and the last one on J.N. Andrews at this point. But they cover most of our Adventist history through the lives and experiences of the pioneers. So there are books on James White, J.N. Andrews, John Loughborough, I wrote that one. John Byington, I wrote that one. Kellogg, John Harvey Kellogg, S.N. Haskell, W.W. Prescott, Louis Sheaf. Louis Sheaf was one of our early black Adventist preachers, Louis Sheaf. E.J. Wagner, A.T. Jones, if I didn't mention him already. That should be about 10, but there are 12 already. That's a good place to start. The earlier volumes were published by the Review and Herald, and then when that went under, Pacific Press picked up the series. So they are currently the ones that are continuing to publish the set, we hope. We haven't seen one for about 3 years, but we hope they will continue. I know that there are currently books being written. I'm writing one myself on Hiram Edson, and there's a woman writing one on Ellen White, focusing primarily on her as a wife, a mother, and a grandmother, which we haven't had a book that did that before on Ellen White. And there's also one being written on George I. Butler. So I know there's 3 more in the works at this point. But that would be a good place to start. They're written with all the scholarly trappings, you know. They've got the footnotes at the end of the chapters, but they're not that hard to read. They're not dry. They're full of stories and anecdotes and descriptions. And, you know, I think the set is basically geared toward an Adventist adult with a college education, okay? So I would recommend starting with that. You can get those through the Adventist Book Center, or you can order them straight from Pacific Press online.
Elder?
Yeah. That would be a start. When you finish all 12 books, then contact me again, and I'll get you started on some more. There's no end to it. There's no end to it. We have some wonderful writers in our denomination. I mean, just take Ellen White, for example, her biography by Arthur White. Wow. I mean, each one of the volumes in that 6-volume set is 500 pages long. So if you read all 6 of Arthur White's biography of his grandmother, you've read 3,000 pages. And that's just on the life of one person, Ellen White. Yes?
I just wanted to also mention for her that the book Tell It to the World by Maxwell is a good book about Adventist history.
Yes, that is geared more toward a younger generation, true. He wrote that about the same time, as a matter of fact, that I was working with Dr. Schwartz on Light Bearers to the Remnant. Light Bearers to the Remnant is geared more toward college-educated individuals. It's much more detailed, depth, breadth, analysis. Tell It to the World is more of an anecdotal, story form, narrative form. It's easier reading, and I would say that it probably is most appropriate for those without a college education who, don't know a whole lot about Adventist history, and it's kind of an introduction. It's sort of like having the appetizer. And after you finish with Maxwell's book, why, go on to Schwartz and Greenleaf's textbook called Light Bearers. It'll give you more depth and detail, the subject matter. Over here, yes.
My sister actually had this question, but it's a good
Could you
thing.
possibly take the mask off so that I could hear you more distinctly?
This is actually my sister's question, but I'm curious about it too. We're Andrews alumna, and we were wondering, when did Emmanuel Missionary College switch from a work for study program to its current scholastic model?
It was a gradual process, really. Obviously, Battle Creek College, its predecessor, was very strong on manual education. And EMC, when Battle Creek College moved down there to Berrien Springs, we have Emmanuel Missionary College. And then in 1959 became Andrews University, which it's been ever since. The process has been gradual. I mean, I can remember when I was a graduate student there in the 70s, there were still work opportunities in the laundry, on the farm, the dairy farm. They had a book bindery there as well. They had a wood shop going as well. So this is 1970s, okay? Not that long ago. What has happened, I would say, there's several factors here. One factor being outside competition. How can an industry compete and make a go of it financially when you've got student laborers who can only work, say, 2 or 3 hours a day, maybe 3 or 4 days a week, and out there in the public domain, you've got adult workers doing the same kind of work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, with probably more up-to-date modern machinery. It's just very difficult to compete with outside industry. Another aspect of it is laws. State laws and federal laws have made it almost impossible for students to work their way through school. I know, when I was at Union Springs Academy, I worked on the farm, and some of the time I worked in the broom shop. They used to allow students to go to school for 4 hours in the morning and work 4 hours all afternoon in the broom shop. And they would do that, 5 days a week, Sunday through Thursday. Well, there's laws in New York State that make that impossible. The laws are designed to protect children, anybody under 18 is a minor, a child, against being exploited. So laws, attitudes toward child labor have changed quite drastically in the last 50 years. So the broom shop had to close, the crate shop had to close, the farm had to close at Union Springs Academy. And our farm at Andrews was really doing quite well until the market in milk fell out the bottom. And then we were incurring thousands and thousands of dollars of debt every year on the farm. You know, they had, I don't know how many hundred cows there they were milking, and then heifers beside. And so they had to close that part of the farm because it was losing money, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Once again, outside competition is more efficient, with more modern machinery, with full-time laborers. We were depending on student laborers, part-time, and sometimes they wouldn't make their work shift, and sometimes they'd be sick, and sometimes they'd take off to study for exams, and it just wasn't reliable labor on the farm. And then the milk situation dropped, and so the farm wasn't making money. So we have a pre-veterinary program still at Andrews, so they've kept a few animals, a few cows, a few horses, goats, sheep, a peacock, an Asian hog, just a few varieties of animals for our pre-veterinary students to work on there. But basically, it's been a combination of economics. It hasn't paid, outside competition, state and federal laws that protect child labor, and students not wanting to work. I mean, we really do face that problem. There are Adventist students who have not been taught the work ethic. They'd rather play than work. They'd rather Google than work. They'd rather play video games than work. So we do have that problem, even at the college level, of students that just don't have the work ethic. I earned most of my way through academy and college. I think I had $2,000 or $2,500 still to pay back in loans when I graduated, but that's almost impossible to do now for the reasons that I've given, okay? So the circumstances are kind of stacked against that. And even growing gardens, I know Union Springs Academy is trying to keep a greenhouse going, but what do you do during the summer? That's prime growing time, and the students are home. You know, they can work in a greenhouse during the school year, but during the summer, they want to be gone. They want to be home. They want to go to summer camp. They want to go to the beach. So we have a problem with labor there. If you can come up with a viable solution, let me know. I'll pass it along to our new president. We're losing our president, you know, at Andrews. Wonderful, wonderful woman, Andrea Luxton. Dr. Andrea Luxton is retiring at the end of this school year. So any of you feel like being a university president, let me know. I'll pass your name along. There's 148 names on the list. No, actually, I think they've narrowed it down to 60 now. But there were 148 on the original list of presidents to replace Andrea Luxton. They still got to narrow that 60 down to only a handful, then they'll interview the handful. And we also are replacing Dwight Nelson. He's retiring as our senior pastor. So if anybody feels like being a senior pastor of a university church, why, let me know. I'll pass your name along. You got somebody there? Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Alan Hoffman. I graduated from Andrews in '93. Follow on to her question about the work study part. I appreciate your answer, but I don't accept it in full because our schools used to require work as part of the education. And the comment about currently students not wanting to work, isn't the point of going to an Adventist school to teach people a better way?
And the simple answer to that is the laws don't allow it. The laws don't allow it. You know, when we could have students work 4 hours a day, 20 hours a week, then that could be credited to their account. But we can't do that anymore. The laws will not allow that. So we're faced with state and federal laws that simply say you can't do that. See, I recently finished writing the centennial history of Union Springs Academy, so I have studied in detail the labor situation at my alma mater, Union Springs Academy, and I have been amazed how tight and picky the New York State labor laws are now. They simply will not allow 16-year-olds to work at all. That's your freshman class, sophomore class. As far as 17 and 18-year-olds, they will allow them to work 2 hours a day, but no more than 10 hours in a week. Well, you can't earn much money that way. And when I was there, students would typically work 20 or more hours a week, particularly the farm crew, would be milking cows early in the morning and then feeding the cows and then milking them again in the evening and feeding them again. The laws will not allow that. Pardon? College? Yeah. Yeah. Well, I haven't written the history of Andrews University. That's Dr. Meredith Jones-Gray is doing that. So I don't know what the Michigan laws are, but I would just guess that the Michigan laws are probably nearly as tight now as the New York laws. They simply are designed to do two things, as I see it. They're designed to protect young people, particularly those under 18 years of age, from labor exploitation, and they're also designed to protect the labor unions and outside commerce from the competition that our industries on campus would provide. And we've run into that problem at Union Springs Academy in the past when the townspeople, county people wanted to lay a tax on our farm and our broom shop because we were making money from the sale of brooms and from the sale of milk. And we had to fight in court to get that dropped. So it's becoming increasingly more difficult to live up to what, you haven't used this word, but I think you would agree with this word, to live up to the blueprint. To live up to the blueprint. The laws of the state and the laws of the federal government just will not permit us to let students work that many hours. It's right there on the statute books. I've read it myself. A 16-year-old may work only 2 hours a week. A 17-year-old may work this many hours a week. An 18-year-old may work that many hours a week, and that's it. No more. Plus, you have all the workers' compensation stuff to deal with, accident reports to write up. It's full of, red ink. Makes it very, very difficult for Adventists to continue in that way. I think of, the next state over, Indiana Academy, used to have some really big industry. They had Harris Pine Mills. Gone. They had a bake shop. Gone. They had a wood shop that made ladders and lawn furniture. Gone. It's the laws. The laws make it very difficult to keep that kind of industry going. Okay, you're missing out on your naps.
Yeah, I think it's time for us to wind up, but I wanted to say thanks for those of you that have come out. It's been a blessing. Last night, this morning, this afternoon, Dr. Strayer, thank you so much for coming and sharing your wisdom, your knowledge with us. I hope that this time together has been an inspiration for you, strengthened your faith in the great Advent movement as God has led us through the years, and most importantly, has strengthened your faith in Jesus Christ, who's at the head of our church. And so we're going to have a word of prayer, and we're going to close. And again, Dr. Strayer, thank you so much for coming, driving all the way down here, and spending your time with us and sharing with us. It's been great to have you here. Father in heaven, thank you so much once again for the way that you have led this great Advent movement through the years, for reminding us here this weekend that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is a movement of destiny, a movement of prophecy and not just merely another church on a street corner. Thank you that you have given us the privilege of being a part of this movement. Help us, Lord, to understand the privilege and responsibilities that come with being a part of it, and help us to rise up like the pioneers of old, to move forward in boldness and faith and love, sharing the great message, the three angels' messages, to a dying world, so that men, women, and children can learn of Jesus and his love for them and find eternal life through him. We ask your special blessing to rest upon Dr. Strayer as he travels back to Michigan. May your angels watch over him and keep him safe. And may you be with each of us, Lord, until we meet again, if not in this world, but ultimately in your kingdom, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen.